Hello and welcome everyone to Resume Writing 101. My name is Nick and I will be your instructor for this online workshop. So without further ado, let's just get started. So we're going to talk about a lot of things regarding resume writing today. Some things I will include is what a resume is, what its purpose is, and what things should and should not go in it. We'll talk about the different resume formats. There are 3 of them we'll talk about and decide which one might work best for all of you. We'll talk about applicant tracking systems, which are a super important matter to recognize and know about, not only when it comes to resume writing, but also job searching and applications in general. We'll talk about some tips in terms of writing, how we can write our resumes a little better for those hiring managers and recruiters, things they want to see. And at the end, we'll briefly discuss cover letters and see why they go hand in hand with resumes. But first and foremost, what is a resume in your mind? Give yourself some time to think about what you think of a resume is. Get an idea of it, whether you've written resumes throughout your whole life or you are just learning how to do this right now for the first time ever. Whatever you think a resume is. I always like to say a resume is a self-marketing tool. Now, I'm sure you all said things to yourselves like it has all your skills and experience, it goes over your work you've done, all you accomplished, and those are all correct. But I like to have this little mindset idea where it's a self-marketing tool, almost like a professional billboard, if you will. I always like to pose people who this man is. If you remember, this man's name is Billy Mays. He was really famous for a lot of different infomercials, primarily OxyClean, but he had other products as well. And Billy Mays is so memorable because of the way he sold his product. In his infomercials, he was first and foremost a salesman, but he was so loud and bombastic, and it really made you pay attention. And I'm sure that many of you might have, purchased a product from Billy Mays or who Billy Mays represented because of how loud and bombastic he was. And for example, his most famous product he ever did, OxyClean, was detergent, cleaning detergent. Not exactly the most exciting of products that are out there, but he sold it in that way that really made you remember him the way he sold it. And that's really the way you want to think of your resume, because just as you might review an advertisement or an infomercial like Billy Mays before you decide to buy a product, for example, an employer is going to review your resume before they decide to interview you. So you really want to write your resume in that exciting way. And I know it's not the most exciting professional documents you'll ever write, but you want to keep that in mind. That it really needs to be catchy and almost salesy in a sense, because it is that self-marketing tool in our professional lives. We also want to think of another mindset thing. What is a resume's exact purpose? What is it used for? A lot of people might say, well, a resume gets you a job, which is something I usually kind of interject, saying, no, it does not get you a job. That's not the purpose it serves. A resume is supposed to get you an interview, a foot in the door. Many times people come to me and say, Nick, I'm getting all these interviews, but nothing ends up happening. What can I do to my resume? And I really say to them, well, if you're getting in the door, if you're getting interviews, phone calls, and things of that nature, the resume seems to be doing its job. That's not really the point where we need to focus on right now. What we need to focus on is the interviewing. So keep that in mind. Your resume is not a static document. It certainly shouldn't be. We'll talk about what changes we'll make consistently every time we apply for a job today. But if your resume is getting you in the door, getting you an interview, it at least is doing its job very good. So keep that in mind when it comes to interviews and applications and hiring processes you might have coming up. These are the 5 basic areas we'll talk about today when it comes to resumes. Primarily, we'll talk about skills and experience because those are the things that really separate you out when it comes to that applicant pile. But all these other areas are important. We'll talk about each of them in short order today. These are some quick tips. I'll go over these a little more specifically today. First and foremost, it says 11 or 12 point font. So that refers to the sizing of the text you want to use in your Word document, that is your resume. Why am I giving you a range? Why not give you one number? Well, some people might be able to fit their information in 12-point font. Some people might need to shrink it down to 11. Either is fine, whatever you prefer. Just make sure it's all consistent all around. I wouldn't go any lower than 11. 10, 9, or 8, that's going to be too small to read, too hard to read. Any higher than 12 is going to be too jumbled, too big on the page there. The only thing that will be different is your name. Your name should be emboldened, and it should be larger than the rest of your text on your resume, but we'll talk about that a little later on. Some fonts we want to stick to when writing a resume are Arial, Verdana, Teoma, and Calibri. Why do we want to stick to these fonts? Well, those applicant tracking systems we'll talk so much about later. These are the fonts that work best with those applicant tracking systems, so keep that in mind for later. Another big thing is the margins or the white space around the text of the page there, like the borders there. that should always be 1 inch around. This is pretty standard. Most Word document processing softwares should start you out in 1 inch margins, but always just double check to be sure before submitting anything. Alright, so here are my 5 most important tips when it comes to resume writing. And that first one there, aim for 1 page in length, is probably the most important. In parentheses, it says 7 seconds. Now that 7-second time period refers to the average amount of time a hiring manager or recruiter will look at a resume. And that is a statistical average. So it really goes to show that we don't really have a lot of time to impress a recruiter, a hiring manager, whoever, an interviewer, with our resume. Now, are they reading everything on that resume in 7 seconds? No, not at all. That's, of course, impossible. But they're looking for major points and little things here and there that they know how to look for to reading a resume. So it's just to really iterate that you want to have the most recent and relevant information on your resume, and really the most important information from all of your work history or your skills or your education. So that'll kind of help you, gives you an idea of how to prioritize your resume with that 7 seconds time frame in mind. And that can even justify the rest of these tips there. So the next 2 tips say we do not need to include every employer, and we only need to include the last 10 to 15 years of work experience. And again, that iterates that we want to have the most recent and relevant information on our resume. So while we may have had a great job from maybe 20 odd years ago, it's something we probably don't want to put on a resume because employers really want to see what you've been doing for the past decade or so. So you really want to think about how you're going to include those jobs in your work experience. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, Nick, what if I've worked 1 job over the past 15? What if I have an absence in my resume? What if I have a gap in my resume? Don't worry about that so much. We'll talk about more about that stuff when we get to the resume formats. These are more so general tips to keep in mind. And that's actually another tangential point I want to bring up, is all these tips are really general tips when it comes to resume writing. If you're in a very specific field, your resume might look a little different than normal, and that is okay. But these are just kind of a catch-all for everyone who might be job searching. Next step down there says we need to tailor or customize our resume for each job application. So what am I saying by that tip? What I am saying is that technically you will have a different resume for every job you apply to. However, you will not rewrite your resume every time you apply for a job. What you'll do is if you'll rewrite it today after listening to this, or you have one already written, that will be sort of like your base resume. And when you go to apply for a job, you'll look at the job description and change it, little tweaks and changes based on that job description. And those tweaks and changes we'll talk about a little bit more when, again, we get into that applicant tracking systems bit a little later on. And that last tip is probably just as important, if not second most important to the first tip, is consistency. One of the big things that most recruiters and hiring managers look for, in my experience, is simply just a consistent resume. Making sure everything looks neat, the style's all the same, and nothing's really different. If your job title is boldened on the first job you have on there, all the other job titles should be boldened for consistency's sake. So make sure your resume is consistent and aesthetically pleasing to read. It doesn't need to be flary or look really, stylistic or anything like that. It just needs to, be easy to read. It just needs to be aesthetically pleasing to the eye. So really keep that in mind when writing your resume. Try not to make it too specific with lines and boxes, and we'll talk about why those things are even worse off later. But make it nice and neat to read. And we'll see some examples of resumes that look nice and neat today in this PowerPoint. Okay, so that's the do's there, the do's of the resume writing. Let's talk about the don'ts of the resume writing. The big one up there is lies or exaggerations. Now, I know most people aren't going to outright lie on their resume, but a lot of people might accidentally exaggerate in their resume. And a number one thing I've seen a lot of times in the past is people might speak, read, or write a few words of another language, and they really want to beef up their resume, so they might put something akin to being bilingual in that language. Now, for example, I speak, read, and write a few words of French. Je parle français parce que l'école. However, I would not consider myself fluent in French by any means necessary. I cannot consistently read in French, consistently write, and certainly cannot consistently speak in French. So I personally would not put I'm bilingual in French on my resume. Some people, like I mentioned, make the opposite judgment call. And then they get to an interview, and the interviewer asks, hey, I see you speak French on your resume. Can you have a conversation with me or my colleague here in French so we understand that you can do that? And that person goes, oh no, I can't actually do that. And that person essentially just lied to that employer on their resume. Maybe that employer, that recruiter, talks to their employer and recruiter friends, maybe in other companies or industries, and they say, hey, watch out for this guy or this girl or this person. This person lied to me in their resume. And you just may have made things a whole lot worse for yourself than you already would have done. So really just make sure everything on your resume is 100% factual to you and what you can do. Next two things there say extraneous information and necessary personal information. So the only personal information that should be on your resume is your name, your phone number, your location or your address, your email address, and your LinkedIn profile URL should you have that. Anything else is really unnecessary, and especially when it comes to those more personal details. I've seen in the past things like proud mother of 2 on a resume or proud father of 3 on a resume, and that is great. Being a parent is a job within its own right, but on a resume, it's not really the information we want to put down. Employers aren't allowed to talk to you about your personal lives in the first place, so they're not really going to take that information into account when it comes to your candidacy. So anything that is too personal or even personal at all should really be left out of a resume. It should be about your work life, your career, your professional life, not your personal life. So really make sure everything on there is professionally relevant. I or my. So the next thing I want to mention is, whose name is at the top of your resume. It should be yours. If it's not yours, it's slightly concerning then. But everything on that resume is assumed to be done or had by that person whose name is at the top of the resume, your name. So I or my is inherently redundant and unnecessary anywhere on a resume. And that may sound a little oxymoronic to hear because we're all taught to write in these full and complete sentences, but a resume is not one of those places. So whether you're going to say, I did this or I did that, it would just be did this, did that. My responsibilities are that? No. Responsibilities were that. We're simply taking out I or my anywhere on your resume. So really leave that all out altogether. The same thing goes with references or references available upon request, that little phrase there. So when I first learned how to write a resume, having that phrase at the bottom of your resume, probably in bold, was still a very popular thing to do. However, nowadays that's not so much the case. Employers know they can ask for references, so they're not really looking for it per se on a resume. And it's really just a waste of space for us, and space is ever so important on a resume, as we'll come to see here. So please leave any reference information, any notion of reference information off of your resume. If they want it, they will ask for it. And you certainly should have your references prepared for any job interview you go to, but that should be a separate document entirely. And lastly, that says niche acronyms or abbreviations. This is what I would refer to as shop talk. Anything that you know because you work within your industry, but maybe I don't know, for example, because I don't work within your industry. You really want to avoid these shop talk items here because let's say you have all these shorthands and acronyms and abbreviations and different sayings of things that you work with in the industry that everyone that you work with knows, but maybe HR recruiter or a new person in the field doesn't really know just yet. Certainly recruiters in different fields start to understand their fields more and more as they grow their pipelines and start really expanding in their job. But I always like to say, consider your resumes being looked at by a recruiter on the first day on the job. That person probably isn't going to know every single last thing about the industry just yet. So you really want to make sure that if it's something that isn't 100% common knowledge, just generally speaking, outside of your industry and the general public knowledge, make sure you spell those things out. Make sure those things are understood easily. And you don't need to go on long tangents about what this means and what that means. Just make sure, someone who doesn't work with your industry can understand it, because maybe if you don't do that, that person might read your resume, have no idea what your skills are, what you're talking about, and pass by your resume or not feel comfortable to bring your resume forward in the interview process. So really make sure you are spelling those things out to an extent. And typically a good rule of thumb for me is that if I have to ask myself, is someone who doesn't work with me, will they understand this? If the answer is no, or even if I have to think about that at all, it's probably better I just spell it out, especially when it comes to those acronyms or abbreviations a lot of us use in our respective fields. Alright, so let's talk about the different sections of a resume and break these sections down bit by bit. The first section we'll talk about is the header. This is that section typically at the top of your page where your name, and contact information will go. Typically, we put this at the center of the page, right there, smack dab where my eyes are going to land on the page. However, some people do like to put this on the left side of the page, where everything is flush to the left side of the margin. We'll see how this looks like in just a second. However, you do decide to use the left justification, that is fine. We'll talk about in the next slide why I think the center justification will always be the better out of the two. As I said earlier, your name should be in bold and should be in 14-point font, or 15 or 16, whatever you prefer. I typically prefer the 16-point font. I kind of going against my own PowerPoint here. just because I find it stands out a little bit more, but 14 is a good recommended starting point if you want to see how the rest of your resume is going to look. The rest of the header should be in 11 or 12 point font. Again, I apologize for the PowerPoint here, but keep that in mind that the header should be consistent with the rest of your resume. So if you write your resume in 12 point font, so is the rest of the header. If you write your resume in 11 point font, so is the rest of the header. And this same header should be used on your reference sheet and on your cover letter. So keep that in mind whenever you write those two other documents. The same header should be used across the board. These are the two justifications you can see, the center on the top and the left on the bottom. And we can kind of see the center justification has that almost nice pyramid-like shape that's very nice and pleasing to read. So it really is good to have that sort of nice breakdown information because it makes it very simple for me to just, really delineate, really understand what's going on there. And the other thing it does that's really neat is that it takes up the white space on each side of the page. And that's another big note about resume writing. A lot of times when I look at resumes, whether they be in my work or from my friends or so on and so forth, a lot of people like to put everything on the left side of the page. And there's all this white space on the right side of the page that's just barren. And it really just looks ever so slightly off. And so keep that in mind. Is another big thing about resume writing is taking up the space of that page. Not necessarily cluttering it, but making sure it's justly used. And that's another reason why I think the center justification for the header here is the better out of two, because it doesn't leave any awkward spaces. Again, the bottom one, the left justification, is fine. If that works better if you're formatting, please use it. But as we can't see here, but we will see on a resume, on the right side of that page, there's going to be all this white space just up there in the corner that might look ever so slightly off. So consider which one you want to use when you write your resume. Again, I think the center justification is going to be the better out of the two, but if you decide to use the left justification, that's perfectly fine as well. Alright, so let's talk about another section, known as the summary. Now, many of you might have used objectives on your resume. I know when I first learned how to write a resume, that's how I was taught to learn a resume, was with an objective. And that's largely have been replaced with summaries. Summaries are concise statements or a concise statement about who you are as a professional. If you think about that interview question, tell me about yourself, the answer to that question is going to be very, very similar to the way you write this summary. I always say the best summaries speak in some sort of quantitative term. Typically, people relegate this to their years of experience in a given area, field, position, or as a manager, as a team leader, whatever it might be. And typically, I say that's a great thing to do, a great idea to use, because it gives more context to what you're talking about in your resume. And really we want to see what employers want. We want to write what employers want in that summary. If they're going to read out anything on your resume in particular in that 7 seconds, the summary might be one of those areas. So you really want to give them a good, clear idea of the resume they're looking at. That's really the main idea of the summary. It should be a summary of the rest of the resume. It should give me an idea of what's going on within this resume. So let's take a look at a summary real quick and break it down real quick as well. So this summary says a diligent and highly motivated food service professional with 4 years of experience in management roles and a thorough understanding of high-end restaurant procedure. So let me break that down. A diligent and highly motivated. Nice, good keyword to start me off. Really want to express whatever I want to express myself. You don't have to use diligent and highly motivated. You can use any number of adjectives or keywords that you think best represent you, but it's a nice way to start it off right away. Then I get food service professional. So I know by that statement alone, those 3 words right there, that this person, this resume, is all about food service, and that they've probably worked in the food service industry, and they plan on working within the food service industry as well. And I get even more credence and more context to that with that next statement, 4 years of experience in management roles. And that's an example of a quantitative term I just talked about. And that gives me an idea that not only is this person a food service professional, but they're also a manager in food service, so at least 4 years of experience. Again, giving more context, more grounding to what this person is. And lastly, a thorough understanding of high-end restaurant procedure. And that even serves just to give me even more context. Now I not only know this person is a manager in food service, so at least 4 years experience in that management field, but they're also more familiar with higher-end locales or restaurants or whatever it might be. They're not just, they're not working particularly at a place maybe like McDonald's or Burger King, maybe more of a higher end restaurant or steakhouse or so on and so forth. And that's, a really typical ideal summary right there. It's not the perfect summary, of course. Of course, there's always can be better, but it gets the job done. And something that it doesn't do is there's no information there regarding looking for a job in this, trying to obtain this role. It doesn't have any of that objective like language in there. It's simply a summary of what you're trying to do. Some other sections of the resume that we'll talk about today. These sections will become more important when we talk about the different formats today. First and foremost, the work experience or work history. Most people choose to relegate this in reverse chronological order, meaning that the most recent job is at the top and they work backwards from there, typically with job-related bullet points under each section. Then we have the skills, competencies, strengths. We really just want to make sure that we have, a basic skills section on there. I typically list it either as skills or skills and qualifications. I wouldn't really list it as competencies or strengths in most cases. Those are just other examples of what this section might be. And this can be keyword skills or statement skills, whatever it might be. Whether, again, you want to write them as keywords or as statements, either of those is fine. And we'll see examples of both of those today. And these can be anything from hard skills, such as knowing how to lay a floor or knowing how to interview someone, to soft skills, such as public speaking and detail-oriented, for example. In addition to those kind of skills, it could also be technology skills, such as knowing Microsoft Office really well, or knowing any specific type of program really well. For example, a nurse or someone who works in the medical field, the healthcare field, might say, I have a really good understanding of Epic medical record systems, for example. So that could be a big catch-all area for all your skills in there. Education, certifications, and licenses is something I typically have to pick a little bone with, because a lot of people like to put education right there, smack dab at the top of their resume, which really, in my opinion, really isn't the case for most people. Education, while important, and while should definitely be on your resume, is probably the least important thing in your resume. Now, why am I saying that? Well, let's say you go to apply for a job and they require that you have a CDLA truck driving license. That employer is going to assume that every one of those applicants has that license. So the fact that you have it doesn't exactly separate you out. The things that will separate you out are the aforementioned skills and work experience, your prior experience and understanding of that field. So again, education is definitely important and should definitely be on the resume, but in most cases it'll probably relegate more toward the bottom of your resume. Now, what kind of people might have education with more detail in it? Well, first and foremost, if you just graduated from a college, or university, or training center with your degree or certification or license, and you don't really have a lot of other work experience or skills to lean on, you can certainly lean more so on your coursework and projects you might have done while at school. It can also be helpful for people in more specific positions, especially, of course, people in the education field. It's probably definitely more important for those kinds of people. And again, those are decisions you have to make on a personal basis. These ideas are more so general. The other little bone at the pick of education is when people aren't finished with education. So I really want to make something clear that when I'm talking about this idea of not being finished with education is that you're still pursuing education. A lot of people ask me, well, Nick, I have about 50 odd credits from NAC or LTRI-C, should I put that information on my resume even though I never got any sort of degree from it? And typically my answer is no. While that education, those classes are important and beneficial to you, employers really want to see that finished product, that license, that education, the degree, whatever it might be. So this next bit primarily applies to those people still in some sort of schooling. Again, whether it be going for a degree or going for a license or going for some sort of training. If you're not finished with that piece of training, make sure you use some sort of qualifying term to let them know that. Whether you're saying your expected graduation date, the credits you've earned, the hours you've earned toward that piece of education, whatever it might be. Just let them know that you are still pursuing it. And this is an issue that a lot of college students, for example, might run into, where maybe they're going to school now and they're going to graduate in May, and they want to start applying for jobs, and they might put that they have an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree on their resume, which technically isn't true because they haven't finished that education yet. They still have to wait till May to receive their official degree. So this is just another example of how we can accidentally exaggerate or lie on a resume. It may be a minor thing in most cases for most employers, but we never really want to have that minor error on something that should be ever so tightly reviewed. So keep that in mind for the education bit there. In these sections, primarily the first two of work experience and skills will change based on what kind of resume you use and what your career has turned out to. Some other sections we'll talk about on the resume. These are sections that be considered a little more supplementary than most. Certainly those sections we talked about just beforehand are the most important sections. But if you have any of these sections to put in, if they're very relevant to the job you're working, or you do a lot in one of these specific sections, definitely want to include that in. The big one I'm going to focus on primarily is volunteer and community service. Volunteer, community service, community involvement, outreach, so on and so forth is music to recruiters' ears, especially in that time of not working. Because it shows that you are doing more past the point of your work. You're doing more for your career, for your professional development, for your community, for the people around you, and you're getting a lot of different skills from all those different areas. Think of any sort of volunteer opportunity. Just one that comes to mind for me is something like the Miller Keystone Blood Center. Maybe you volunteer at a blood drive, for example, helping people in that event. Just from that event alone, you're probably going to get things such as event management, data entry, customer service, communication skills, maybe even public speaking skills in some cases. So you never know what kind of skills you may get from any volunteer community service opportunity. And that's why recruiters love to see that information on something like a resume. So if you do have any volunteer work, make sure to put that down there. Talk about what you did, talk about the organization you were involved with. If it's professionally relevant, you can actually put it as a work experience. This is something I actually did, where I used to volunteer and teach workshops akin to what I teach now at CareerLink on the resume there. So you could actually list it as a volunteer opportunity as well. But the other sections are important as well. If you're any sort of professional organizations, it seems like there is a professional organization for every field nowadays. So I'm sure there's one out there for your field. Definitely put that down because, again, it has the same idea that you're constantly trying to better yourself, make yourself more rounded as an individual or as a professional in that field. The same thing goes for any professional development, any minor certificates or trainings you might have gone through. If you have anything like that that's still relevant, certainly put that stuff on there. If you received any awards or got any accolades from your work, certainly that is helpful because it shows an employer that, hey, you've been, lauded for your work in the past. It shows that you do a great job. Definitely want on there. And military service, especially for our veterans. First and foremost, thank you all veterans who might be watching this, for me personally. But certainly if you have military service in your background, make there a military service section on your resume. A lot of employers are not only sometimes preferential to hiring veterans, but also really like to see all the skills and experiences you've gotten from your military jobs there. The other thing I do like to note is that the military does have a lot of acronyms and shorthands and things they like to use. So if you're a veteran and you're having trouble translating those things to some more civilian terms, CareerLink's website actually has a military civilian translator that you can use in your resume writing. Alright, so let's talk about the different resume formats, the big three as I call them. We'll kind of break these down piece by piece. And again, why are there three different kind of ways of writing a resume? Well, that's because not everyone has had the same exact career. Not one format is going to fit all if everyone has had different careers with this job over there and that job over here, or this gap here, that gap there. So we really want to think about, what resume style we may want to use. So I'll kind of run through these and see which ones are going to be best for different kinds of people. The first one we'll talk about is known as the chronological resume. This is the most common type of resume format. This is the one that is most commonly taught to people at some point in their lives, whether it's in school or at a training institute or through some sort of class or workshop like my workshops, for example. And this is the resume that is going to focus on work experience in particular. You can kind of look at that resume in the PowerPoint there and see, a majority of that page is solely dedicated to the work experience and the progression there of the work experience. We can see that everything in each section under each job is described using different bullet points, and we kind of see the bullet points sort of increase in responsibility as it goes from job to job. That chef job at the bottom has 3, the assistant manager job has 4, and the general manager job has 5. And that really shows, again, that idea of a progression. That's really the main idea behind this resume. People who should use this resume are people who have had a pretty consistent and progressive career, where they have, gained new experiences or, were promoted several times in their career. These are best for people who also have little to no gaps in their resume or absences or anything like that. Their work history, again, has been stable and consistent. And then this is great for people also who intend on going into the same career that's on their resume, essentially. They're not looking to change careers or looking to a new career. They're simply staying within the one they are in right now. And if all those things apply to you, then this resume is going to work fantastic for you. However, If those things don't apply to you, if you have gaps in your resume or absences, or you've worked consistently but you worked a lot of different kinds of jobs in your time, or maybe you have had one job over the past 10 to 15 plus years, there could be a lot of different reasons as to why this resume is going to work for you. So that's why we want to look at the other types of resumes here. Before I hop off this one, think of Chronological as the work experience focus oriented resume. That's really the main idea behind this resume. So let's look at its polar opposite then with the functional resume. Functional is going to primarily focus on the skills over the work experience there. And it's a little more flexible for some people out there when it comes to this experience. And this resume is best meant for different kinds of people, whether they have gaps in their work history, if maybe they're returning to the workforce after an absence, maybe they're changing careers or industries entirely, or even if they just have a lot of different jobs out there and it's really hard to, kind of put them all together into one consistent resume. So if any of those things apply to you, the gaps, the absences, the career changes, the different jobs that you might have had, very wilding different careers throughout your time, this resume is best for you because that skills and qualifications section now that is taking up the majority of the page in this resume is meant to be a little more general, a little more across the board. So maybe you might have had a lot of different jobs in your work experience, but you want to underline what things are marketable to the job you're applying for now from all those jobs. It may be a little difficult for you to list those marketable skills in each specific section. It might just be easier for you to have one general skills section and qualification section, sort of taking from both your skills and work experience and putting them in one nice little section there. I'm going to see here too that we make it easier on ourselves by making sure we're using bulleted statements as opposed to bulleted keywords as we saw on the last resume. So really think about, if this resume would be right for you. This resume is ideal for those people, especially if you do have a lot of gaps or absences and you can't really have a nice, easy way of filling those gaps or absences. This takes the focus off of those work experience gaps or absences and puts it more so on these skills and qualifications. So they'll be, much more impressed with your skills rather than worrying about the gaps or absences right away. That being said, they are still going to be concerned or looking into the gaps or absences. Just be ready to explain those gaps or absences. And I always say to people when it comes to explaining something like gap or absences, talk about things you were doing other than job searching, other than what might have caused the gap. Let's say you have a huge gap in your resume because, it happens to the best of us, you just couldn't land a job. Nothing seemed to land. You were interviewing, you were constantly rewriting your resume, you were networking, you do all these things, but nothing seemed to land. You really don't want to go into an interview or a phone screening, and when they ask you, well, hey, Nick, what happened with this 9-month gap here? And say, well, I was job searching. In an interview where you're supposed to present yourself in a valuable way, that's not really exactly the most valuable way to do that. So it's a lot better to talk about things like volunteer community service or professional development, getting new skills for your career, or doing things such as further networking events or going to some of those job-specific organizations. Anything else that indicates what you were doing with your free time that really benefited you, upskilling yourself in some sense of the word. So just be ready to explain it in that sense of the idea there. So that is the functional resume. Again, the work experience resume is the chronological resume. The skills focused resume is the functional. There's one more we got to talk about. What will that one do? Well, that one is going to do exactly what it sounds like it's going to do. It's going to combine the prior two areas. So the combination resume, at first glance, looks very, very similar to the chronological resume. The only noticeable difference you can probably see right now is that where skills were below work experience on the chronological, now they are above work experience on the combination. And this resume, as I mentioned, is simply just going to take those two resumes we just saw, both the functional and chronological, and sort of combine them together. Now, this resume is meant to be a little more adaptable, a little more flexible than the other two. The other two are somewhat rigid in what they focus on. The chronological resume focuses on the work experience. The functional resume focuses on the skills. This resume is meant to sort of even those out in a little more specific justification. So let's say, for example, you were one of those people back in the third or fourth slide I was talking about where you have 10 to 15 years in one job, and your prior position was, 10, 15 plus years. And maybe you were worried about that time saying, oh, well, Nick, what am I going to do if you only want the past 10 to 15 years on a resume? what am I going to do? Only put one job on my resume? And honestly, the answer is yes. But you'll explain that job in a lot more detail on your resume. But what you'll do is explain a lot more about your skills and qualifications. Imagine almost if you had a slider between the skills section and the work experience section. If that slider was pushed down, skills got bigger, work experience got smaller. If it was pushed up, the opposite would happen. That's really the adaptability nature of this resume. Making so you can write it to fit what your work experience has been, especially if you're in one of those more specific situations. And those specific situations can be, if you're just starting out in your career. A lot of college students, people who are just starting out in the working world in general, people who've graduated high school and don't go to college or anything like that, end up using something that might look like this because maybe they have some work experiences, maybe they have some college courses or classes they've taken or whatever, but they don't have a lot of it to justify having a whole chronological resume for, nor do they have a lot of skills to justify a whole functional resume for. So this is where a combination resume comes really in hand to help them out specifically. It also, as I already mentioned, helps off people who might have been laid off or left a long-term position. Because again, we don't want to go back past that 10 to 15 year mark in our work experience. So this helps us with that skills section to make it a little more easy for us to include that information right then on in there. And one thing I really want to emphasize about that skills section, while you may see it with bolded keywords here, it doesn't have to be bolded keywords at all. It could be bolded statements as we saw on the prior functional resume. So think about what ways you may want to indicate your skills and qualifications and your work experience, and think of how a combination resume may benefit you. No resume is better than the other ones, but the combination resume is one I find most people tend to cling to because it is the easiest, or not the easiest to say, but more so the most adaptable resume to work with. And a lot of people will also say to themselves, well, I've already written my resume like that, and that's how I've been writing my resume, and that's great. That's what you should keep doing. So keep that in mind. The other thing I want to mention about these formats is that don't be afraid to branch out to using one or two. You don't have to rigidly stick to one specific format. You can use 2 or 3 of them. You may find for some jobs maybe a combination resume works better, but for some other jobs a functional resume works a lot better. So keep that in mind. Don't be afraid to branch out and mess around and play with these resumes a little bit further. Okay, with that talk out of the way, we're getting into our next little big talk here about applicant tracking systems, that word you've been hearing a lot of times in the past. So, applicant tracking systems are really important to think about when it comes to resume writing and when it comes to applications. A lot of people, when they go to use sites like Indeed or Monster or Glassdoor to job search, those big job search engines, those big job search websites, they often complain that they either, send out applications and all they get back are automated, rejection letters, or they send applications and it feels like they sent their applications out into a black hole. Applicant tracking systems are likely the reason why that's happening. So what are applicant tracking systems exactly? Well, applicant tracking systems are computer programs primarily used by mid to large size companies to scan through job applications. Let's take a company like Amazon, for example. It gets hundreds of thousands of applications a day. Do you think they have teams of people in piles to the ceiling going through each resume hand by hand? Of course not. That's probably impossible and very inefficient. And so what companies do is they use these applicant tracking systems to sort of filter the applications. They tell these applications, or these applicant tracking systems, I should say, to say, hey, I want you to find applications, find resumes, find cover letters with these certain keywords or skills. These are the things I want in my resumes. Find me resumes that have that. And the applicant tracking system says beep, boop, bop, you got it. And they pull resumes that have those. And then what they do with those other resumes that don't have those, they get those automated responses or no response at all. They kind of sift them out from the pile and give the resumes that they really want to see to the employer. And with the keywords, companies typically going to choose a certain number of those keywords in order to be a passing resume for the applicant tracking system. There is no certain number that works across the board. Typically a good number I recommend to people when it comes to those keywords or skills is 8, but every applicant tracking system works a little differently. But what does that exactly mean with keywords and skills and all that fun stuff? How do we pick keywords? What are they? What are they looking for? Well, let's talk about that more in the next slide. So how can I get past these applicant tracking systems, these sort of digital gatekeepers, if you will? Well, the main thing is customizing your resume for each application, having those specific keywords from the job description on your resume. So we talked about this earlier, that each resume we send out should be different for each job application. This is where this is primarily going to come into play with these applicant tracking systems. So what are we specifically going to do with these keywords? Well, those keywords again can be job-specific skills or skills they have on the resume, on the job description. So they're asking for you to be detail-oriented, or to have communication skills, to know how to, maybe drive a truck, or lay a floor, or, cook food, or, prepare an IV, or whatever it might be. Any of those job-specific skills, or soft skills, or technology skills, such as knowing Microsoft Office. All those things, all those skills you find written throughout the job description are keywords. So you want to keep those things in mind. And the customization you're primarily going to do is changing those keywords in particular. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're looking at a job description and it asks you to be, detail-oriented. That skill keeps popping up again and again and again. And you have on your resume that you have a great attention to detail. You might think to yourself, great, detail-oriented, attention to detail, those two things mean the same thing to me. That's what they're looking for. However, Applicant Tracking System is a computer program who's not taught to read and write in English. They're taught to be programmed to understand certain things. So the Applicant Tracking System isn't looking for attention to detail, it's looking for detail-oriented. So one of the minor changes, for example, that you might make is changing attention to detail on your resume to detail-oriented. So that's a big, great example of how you may want to change your keywords around, particularly taking the verbatim keywords from the job description and putting them on your resume. Now, as I mentioned before, 8 is kind of my magic number of keywords you want to take. You don't want to take too much because that might overload the system in general, and of course you want to take too few because that might not get you picked up at all. Kind of think of it like the 3 little bears. Not too little, not too much, just right. And that will obviously depend on the length of the job description too, so the 8 number may not always apply. If you get a really short job description, you're going to have less keywords to pick from. If you get a longer job description, you'll have more keywords to pick from. So that's a good idea to keep in mind when it comes to those keywords right then and there. Some other things we want to keep in mind is we want to avoid using any sort of resume templates or builders. So a lot of people like using those templates or builders where they have the resume all laid out and they just have to fill their information in. We really want to generally avoid those things. Typically, resume templates or resume builders have things known as text boxes on them. And text boxes are essentially shapes on a Word document. And applicant tracking systems do not read text boxes or any sort of formatting tools of that nature, especially when it comes to those templates. So sometimes you may have the exact resume. You may change the keywords appropriately, but just because you have it in a text box or anything like that, it's not actually picking any of that stuff up at all. So, with this being said, you want to basically format the resume by yourself. You don't want to use a template. You don't want to use a format that's predetermined for you. You want to format it entirely on your own, which may sound a little tedious to hear, but it is better when our resumes actually start getting picked up by these systems. We also want to talk about those fonts we used earlier. Again, I mentioned those fonts in the very beginning today. Arial, Verdana, Teoma, and Calibri. Those are the fonts we want to stick to. Those fonts work the best with these applicant tracking systems. Particularly, I'm going to rule out Times New Roman. Now, Times New Roman is a very popular font. It's used in a lot of schools, a lot of educational institutions, a lot of training institutions, a lot of businesses use it, and all around it's just a well-known font for most people. However, Times New Roman has little tweaks and changes in the font that sometimes set off applicant tracking systems. For example, think of the uppercase T's in Times New Roman. Those T's typically point down. Those little changes sometimes might set off an applicant tracking system, and sometimes might make it so the applicant tracking system doesn't read it at all. So, while Times New Roman may be your favorite font you've been using for years and years and years, unfortunately it's something we want to avoid now when we're writing resumes. We also want to avoid any images or pictures. Applicant tracking systems can't understand graphics or pictures or anything of that nature, so we really want to avoid anything like that. So if you have a picture of yourself in a resume, please get that off right now. That's meant for something more so like a curriculum vitae. If you have any sort of graphics or cartoons or images or anything else of that nature on your resume, please take all that off because it might mess up your formatting in the eyes of the applicant tracking system, or the system might not read your resume at all. So make sure there are no pictures or graphics or anything on your resume whatsoever. You want to avoid any other font colors other than black. This is not really a hard rule. Certainly it's not going to be an end of the world if you have a different color font on your resume, But this is more so for consistency's sake, and sometimes this rule does come into play where maybe it doesn't understand, different colored text in there. So just keep it simple, keep it plain, stick to black text. And lastly, we don't want any fancy bullet points or formatting tools. So with the bullet points first, dots or blocks will serve us just fine. We don't want to use the arrows or the diamonds or anything else that might be too picturesque, because again, it might mess up the applicant tracking system outright. The other thing is with those formatting tools. We don't use anything that is going to be too reminiscent of those templates or builders we talked about earlier. Particularly what I will point out is a lot of people like to use a horizontal black line under the header. So if you kind of look at this slide right in front of you, imagine if that top there where it says, how can I get past applicant tracking systems, it was your header. And then you have that line right there. In this case, it's blue, but on a resume, it obviously would be black. And then the rest of your resume is under on this slide there. When an applicant tracking system reads a resume with a line like that, what it sees is first and foremost the header. It sees that line, and then it reads that line as a page break, and then it adds a blank page in between that line and the rest of your resume. So now your resume's formatting is all messed up, and it's just because you had that horizontal black line right then and there. So really avoid anything like that altogether. Any horizontal, any vertical line that comes across the page altogether. Certainly we don't want to use page borders. I see some people do use anything that might go vertically or horizontally across the page altogether, where you generally want to avoid. So that's kind of applicant tracking systems in a nutshell. I really recommend that you may look up some information or look at the handout. Should it be uploaded to the website with more information on this topic. Alright, so now we're getting to the close to the end of things here. We have some more topics to talk about. First and foremost, we'll talk about what employers want to see in a resume. This really comes down to one or two slides. Mainly the idea is that we want to use more problem action result statements in our resume. So what exactly is a problem action result statement? Well, problem action result statement is a sort of guideline for writing and speaking, in this case writing of course, as to how we want to orient our writing essentially. And it's going to be a slot in, slot out format. So each statement should have a problem, should have an action, should have a result. So to explain this better, let's take a look at how this works in practice. So first and foremost, we're going to look at what I would call a basic statement. Something that is just a general statement that you might be seeing on a resume, not exactly anything too up there. So it might say responsible for office filing system. And that's fine. That gives me a fine idea of what this person does, but it doesn't give me everything there. It might not give me the full story. It's not the most exactly eye-catching of statements. So let's take this statement and turn it into a problem action result statement. So it says designed and implemented innovative file management system to replace antiquated system, resulting in an increase of staff efficiency. Now that gives me a lot more information than the prior statement, and they say essentially the same thing. In the left statement, I see this person might have just been tasked with managing actual files. In the right statement, the PAR statement, I see this person actually saw an inefficient system, decided to do something about it, and that action they took actually had a positive impact on the organization. That's really what we want to try to indicate to an employer. If that employer reads increase in staff efficiency, they might be thinking, well, if you increase staff efficiency there, what can you do for my company, for my organization? So we really want to write more of these problem action result statements. Now, do you always have to write a problem action result statement? No. It's more so of a guideline and jumping off point to give you an idea of how you may want to write. You may want to consistently better, prove your ideas. Because again, the right statement kind of gives more of an idea of how you are able to identify those issues and take steps in order to solve them, rather than just talking about a task in general for your resume writing. So keep that in mind. Try to talk more about specifics in your resume. And that really leads me nicely into this next little slide here, where first and foremost we want to talk about, keeping our summary, keeping our tasks from being too subjective. Try to quantify anything. Numbers on a resume will really, really stand out on that resume. So if you took, phone calls every week, how many phone calls? Was it 50? Was it 100? Was it 300? If you were in charge of a budget, how big was that budget? If you were in charge of a calendar, how many events were on that calendar? How many different things can you quantify? That's really what you want to focus on, because it gives, again, more context, like you talked about the summary, to what your work experience is saying for itself. So really keep that in mind right then and there. We also want to watch our verb tense. Make sure we're using the correct verb tense. So past positions should be in past tense verbs. Present positions should be in present tense verbs. We also don't want to use periods, except in our summary, which may be a little oxymoronic thing to hear again. But again, the resume is one of those places where those grammatical and writing rules don't really apply. So we don't really want to use periods in our bullet points, in our skills section, or anywhere. The only time, again, we're going to use periods is if we have a summary that's longer than one statement. If I have a one statement summary, no period is necessary. But let's say I have two statements. I should probably have a period at the end of the first statement and a period at the end of the second statement, for example. So that's the only time periods would exist on a resume. We also want to watch our line spacing. Sometimes when you start out a new Microsoft Word document, it starts you out in 1.5 or 1.15. Always double check that. Make sure it's single line, 1.0 line spacing. And the last thing on this slide to talk about is that picture right there. We want to peer edit. Have someone else other than you look over your resume. Now, this doesn't have to be a resume expert or writer like I am. It could be your significant other, or your brother, or your mother, or your father, or your sister's former roommate, whoever it might be. Someone other than you, someone who isn't you, whose eyes haven't gotten adjusted to your resume. Because yes, that has happened. By working on your resume again and again and again, looking over it 15, 20, 20,000 times, your eyes have gotten adjusted to that resume and are probably skipping over little details that you don't see right away. And this happens to everyone. It happens to me. It happens to all of the colleagues I have at CareerLink and other jobs. We all do this because we're all just people, and that's okay. That's where it really is important to have someone else proofread the resume and catch those little grammatical mistakes, those little errors that are ever so important to hiring managers and recruiters. Alright, so the last topic we're going to talk about today is the cover letter. And that tagline down there says, resume's little brother, he has to take everywhere. So why am I saying that tagline? Well, a lot of people, when I ask them, do you submit a cover letter when you apply for a job? And typically the answer is no, or it depends. Very people say they do it every single time, which is really what we want to do. We want to submit a cover letter every single time we apply for a job. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, that may give us a little bit of an edge over the other applicants in that applicant pool, simply having that cover letter right then and there. So keep that in mind. We do want to submit a cover letter every single time we apply for a job. Even if it is optional, it could give us that extra edge. The only time we really don't want to submit a cover letter is if we don't have any sort of place to put it. If the application doesn't have a section where it says cover letter optional or an ability to attach additional documents. If there's no other section, we're not going to try to submit that along with the resume. That's the time where we will omit it from the application. But in most cases, we should have an application that gives us that opportunity, especially on a site like Indeed. So let's talk about what a cover letter exactly is before we talk about how to write one in particular. I always like to say a cover letter is a resume personalized in writing. A resume, if you think about it, are the cold, hard facts, skills, qualifications about yourself. You don't really talk to someone on a resume. It's more of a fact sheet, more of a highlight reel of what your experiences have been. A cover letter takes those experiences and those qualifications and gives them a little more personality, a little more character, which is really the other main idea behind the cover letter, is that cover letters give employers an idea of not only your writing skills, but also your character. It's sort of the first impression before the first impression, if you will. So we really want to write it in such a superb way to express our character and express our writing skills in particular. So what exactly will go into a cover letter? Well, first and foremost, we're going to start with how we found the position, how we and the company. Whether we found the job online, or we were referred to by an employee of theirs, or referred to by a colleague of that company, however it might be, let them know how we came across their company and the position. Then we'll talk about our interest in the position and the company, and I really want to emphasize that "and" right there, because a lot of people tend to choose one or the other, and we really don't want to leave one or the other out. We want to have a little line or two for each of them, saying I'm interested in this position because of X, Y, and Z. I'm interested in this position, this company because A, B, and C. Whatever it might be, try to indicate that you're interested in both of those things, because employers are looking for you to be interested in not only the job you're doing, but also working for their company in particular, their mission statement, their values, their culture. Then what you're going to do is take a skill from the job description and write a job-specific anecdote proving that skill that you say you have. This is the meat of the cover letter. This is where the most people tend to sort of mess up here. So a lot of people might say, well, I have this skill and I've proven it at this job, and that job, and that job, and that job. Or they say I have this skill, and at this job I've proven it all the time, all over the place. But they never talk about anything too specific. And really what they do is end up rewriting their resume in a different format, which is not really the purpose of a cover letter. The purpose of a cover letter is to be a supplement or a complement to your resume, not a reproduction of one. So really keep in mind that you want to get really uber specific. I have this skill, and this one time at this one job, this happened, and this is how I responded to it. This was the result of my actions, and this is how I've proven that skill in that time I just discussed. That may sound very familiar, just like we just talked about, doesn't it? That sounds a lot like a problem, action, results statement. So another good way to think about this meaty section of the cover letter is sort of an extended problem, action, results statement that serves to prove a skill they're looking for. And again, I cannot emphasize how specific you want to be in that skill with that job-specific anecdote. Then you'll end with thank you. Thank you for reading my letter. You'll give some contact information to reach you. So typically you want to tell them your phone number and your email right here, even if it is up in the right-hand corner in your header, or the center corner as well. And you want to leave some sort of hopeful remark. I hope to hear from you soon. I hope to meet you soon. I hope to whatever with you soon. Something that sounds nice. Something that leaves the cover letter on a good note. Some other minor things we want to think about when it comes to the cover letter is, one, again, make sure we always submit a cover letter, even as an optional, because that may give us that edge over someone else. And two, make sure our resume and cover letter is in the correct format, the correct file format that they're looking for. So whether it's a Word document or a PDF or whatever they're looking for, make sure we are following the instructions of the job application to a T and making sure they're looking for the best thing possible. If they do give you the option, it's another common question I get, should I use a Word document or PDF? I typically say a Word document, because typically applicant tracking systems can better understand those Word documents than they can a PDF. So if you do have the option between Word document and PDF, then I would go with the Word document. Okay, so the last little thing I'll mention today is this website right in front of you here called onetonline.org. onetonline.org is a job informational site taken from a national survey produced by the government. ONET Online has no jobs there to apply to, although it does link to jobs you can apply to. It's purely for job information. This could be helpful for a variety of reasons past resume writing, but specifically when it comes to resume writing, it gives us an idea of what skills or qualifications jobs may need, what different summary information may be helpful when it comes to those job informations, and just general ideas of how we may want to also write our own resume. So I do highly recommend looking into ONET Online, again, past the idea of resume writing even in general, to see what might be helpful for your own resume writing. Other than that, that is everything we had to talk about today, so I really hope this class helped you all out in some way, shape, or form. I really hope that this one helps you write your resume and get those applications sent out there. And other than that, stay safe, stay healthy, and keep on keeping on.